I can see the countdown clock that appears above anyone who has already decided, in their heart, to leave the person they love. 28 weeks pregnant, standing in my own kitchen, I watched one bloom above my husband's head for the first time. 22 days. By midnight that same night, the power that showed me his countdown turned around and showed me something far worse about my baby's father. I've had this gift since I was 7 years old, since the afternoon I told my aunt that her husband was leaving in 9 days, and every adult in the room looked at me like I'd said something obscene at the dinner table. He left on day 9, exactly the way I'd seen it, 2 suitcases, no goodbye. After that, my mother sat me down and taught me 2 rules before she taught me almost anything else. Never say the number out loud, and never, ever try to look for your own. That second rule turned out to be less a rule than a mercy, because I can't see my own countdown even when I try. That's the gap in the power, the blind spot that has kept me sane and stupid in equal measure for 21 years. I can read the exact shape of everyone else's ending. I have never once been able to look inward and know if I'm the one about to be left, or the one about to leave, or neither. My father ran Callaway Shipping into the ground the same year my mother died, and by the time Desmond Ashcroft offered to absorb our contracts in exchange for what he called a more permanent arrangement between the families, I understood exactly what I was being asked to become. Not a wife. A bridge. I said yes because my father wept with relief when I did, and because at 24 I had already spent 17 years learning how to be useful instead of loved. He called me the morning after the engagement was announced, before the ink on anything was dry, and thanked me the way you'd thank someone for donating a kidney. You don't know what this means for us, Nora. For the company your grandfather built. I told him I was happy for him, because it was easier than telling him the truth, which was that I had spent the whole night before staring at the ceiling wondering if I would ever again make a decision about my own life that wasn't also a rescue for someone else's. Julian was never cruel in any way you could point to a name. He was cold in the way you had to live inside a marriage to notice, the way he'd thank me warmly in front of his father and forget I existed the second we were alone, the way his hand on the small of my back at company events felt like someone steering a piece of furniture into place. Our first anniversary, he had his assistant book a table at the restaurant where he'd taken every important client that year, and gave me a bracelet his assistant had also picked out, still in the branded paper bag, receipt folded neatly inside like he expected me to return it. I wore it anyway. Halfway through dinner his phone buzzed with a shipping delay in Rotterdam and he took the call at the table, and I sat there in a dress I'd bought myself, eating a dessert I hadn't ordered, and realized that the only person who'd said happy anniversary to me that whole day, unprompted, was Gabriel, who wasn't even supposed to remember our wedding date at all, and somehow always did. The 2 years before this pregnancy finally held were their own kind of quiet devastation. I remember one appointment specifically, an ultrasound that found nothing where something should have been growing, and the doctor's careful voice explaining statistics I didn't want to hear, and Julian's hand finding mine in the exact right way, at the exact right moment, warm and steady. "We'll get through this together," he said, and I believed him so completely that I apologized to him afterward, in the parking garage, for not being able to give him what every appointment seemed to confirm I couldn't give him. He held me while I cried. I didn't know yet that he was holding a secret at the same time he was holding me. Somewhere around the 6th month of this pregnancy, the power started changing, getting stranger and stronger both at once, like it was feeding on something the baby itself was giving it. The countdowns I saw on other people started arriving with edges now, small flickers underneath the number, like a radio catching a second station bleeding through the first. I didn't understand yet what those flickers meant. I only knew they cost me something every single time I let myself feel curious about them. So when the number bloomed above Julian's head that Tuesday morning, pale gray, floating half an inch over his hairline, the digits turning slowly like an old airport departure board, I dropped the coffee mug I was holding. It shattered against the tile. Julian didn't even glance up from his phone. "Careful," he said, not unkindly, not kindly either. "You're 7 months pregnant, not 7 years old." 22 days. I stood there with coffee soaking into my socks and did the math without wanting to. 22 days from that Tuesday landed exactly on the night of the Ashcroft Foundation Gala, the biggest date on his father's calendar, the night Desmond had already announced to 300 guests and a business journal that he'd be introducing the next generation of the Ashcroft family. I called my sister Beth that afternoon, hands still shaking, and got as far as "I need to tell you something strange" before she laughed, and said she had a lunch meeting, could she call me back later? She never called back, and I never brought it up again. I had already learned that lesson once, at 7 years old, in my aunt's living room. Some truths you only get to say out loud one time before the room decides you're the problem instead of the news. The only person in that entire house who ever looked at me like a person instead of a placeholder was Julian's half-brother, Gabriel Reyes, and even that felt like an accident of geography more than affection, since Gabriel wasn't permitted to use the Ashcroft name, let alone sit anywhere near the head of the table. Gabriel was born in Marseille 29 years ago, the result of 11 days Desmond spent overseas, auditing a shipping partner while his wife sat home pregnant with Julian. Desmond brought Gabriel into the household when he was 12 after his mother died, and then spent the next 17 years making sure everyone remembered that Gabriel was a mistake that got absorbed, not a son who got chosen. He ran the Coveport shipping yard now, the same yard that used to belong to my father, and he still ate most of his dinners standing up in the kitchen, because Desmond's dining room had an unspoken seating chart with no place set for him. Gabriel was the one who noticed I'd started counting things with my fingers without realizing I was doing it. Stares, seconds, the beats of silence between Julian's texts. He was the one who kept ginger candy in his jacket pocket after the nausea got bad in my first trimester, and in 3 years he never once asked me a question about the pregnancy that was secretly about Julian's approval instead of my body. That same week the countdown appeared, he found me in the shipping yard office folding a strip of paper into a link and adding it to a chain of nearly feathers coiled inside an old cigar box. "What's that?" he asked, in the plain way people ask questions they actually want answered. I told him the truth, or part of it, that I'd been making a chain like this since I was 7, one link for every day I needed to survive until something I couldn't control was finally over. I didn't tell him what I was counting down to now. He just nodded like it made perfect sense and said, "My mother used to scratch tally marks into the wall behind our bed, back in Marseille, different chain. Same math." Then he handed me a candy, changed the subject, and for 11 minutes, sitting on a stack of shipping pallets, I forgot to be afraid of anything at all. The tenderness never lasted long in that house, because it never does. 4 days after the countdown appeared, I picked up Julian's tablet by mistake instead of my own. They were the same model, a stupid coincidence, and a calendar notification was still glowing on the lock screen. Movers confirmed. 2-bedroom Meridian Row address, delivery window the 23rd. The 23rd was 1 day after the gala, 1 day after Julian's countdown was set to hit 0. I told myself there could be another explanation. Storage for nursery furniture, maybe, or a corporate apartment for some visiting executive. I told myself that until I saw the second line of the notification, the one I couldn't unsee. Confirm with C before Friday. C. Camille Duval had been a family friend for as long as I had been an Ashcroft wife, the daughter of Desmond's oldest business partner, the woman Desmond had wanted for Julian long before I ever walked into a room. I set the tablet back down exactly where I'd found it, screen dimming, and went and sat on the bathroom floor for 11 minutes, because it was the only room in that house that didn't feel like it was watching me. Gabriel drove me to my 29-week appointment 2 days later, because Julian had a call that couldn't move, which was true only in the sense that every one of Julian's calls apparently couldn't move anymore. Gabriel white-knuckled the wheel the whole way like the car itself might go into labor. "Should I be taking notes?" he asked, completely serious, when the technician asked if we wanted to hear the heartbeat rate out loud. "Is 140 a good number? Do I need to write that down?" I laughed for the first time in 11 days, right there on the exam table with cold gel still on my stomach, and the technician looked between the two of us and asked, very carefully, if Gabriel was the father. Neither of us corrected her fast enough. It took 4 full seconds. Neither of us has ever talked about those 4 seconds since. 2 nights later, Julian actually came home before 9 p.m. For once, for a foundation reception at the house, and for about an hour I watched him perform the husband I used to believe he was, refilling my water glass without being asked, laughing at something a board member's wife said, resting one hand briefly on my stomach for the benefit of exactly the 3 people standing close enough to see it. I used to live for those hours. That night, for the first time, I watched the performance instead of believing it, and across the room I caught Camille watching him too, not with the polite interest of a family friend, but with the specific, patient attention of someone checking that an investment was still on schedule. Julian caught her eye for less than a second, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with foundation receptions at all. Nobody else in that room saw it. I saw all of it. Gabriel showed up 2 days after that with a flat-pack crib under one arm and instruction sheet in a language he swore was English, and spent 2 hours on the nursery floor building something that ended up structurally sound but backwards, the drop side facing the wall, so that for one glorious evening the only way to reach the mattress was by climbing over the headboard. He refused to admit defeat and refused to read the instructions a second time, and by the end I was laughing so hard my stomach hurt in the good way, the way I hadn't laughed since before any of this started, while he stood there covered in packing foam insisting, with total sincerity, that the crib had character now. I didn't take it apart for 2 days, partly because I couldn't stop smiling every time I looked at it. At the family dinner that Friday, Desmond spent 20 minutes describing the gala seating chart like it was a military campaign, and somewhere between the shareholders' table and the press table he said, without lowering his voice at all, the Calloway girl did her job. Now we just need her to hold together for 3 more weeks and look presentable doing it. The Calloway girl, 3 years married into that family, 7 months carrying his grandchild, and I was still the Calloway girl whenever he was annoyed. Julian didn't correct him, Julian didn't even look up from his plate. Camille arrived for dessert, the way she always did, never earlier, as if she'd calculated the exact minute her presence would sting the most. She bent down to kiss my cheek and murmured, "Just for me, you must be so relieved. Almost done being useful." She smiled the entire time she said it. Nobody else at that table heard a single word, and when I looked over at Julian to see if he'd noticed anything, he was checking his watch. I started recording things after that dinner. Not out of any grand plan, I genuinely didn't know yet what I was building toward, just a small voice memo app I'd open in my pocket whenever Desmond or Julian started talking business at the table, because some instinct older than the countdown itself told me I would need proof of something eventually, even if I couldn't have said proof of what. That same night, lying awake beside Julian's turned back, I did something my mother told me never to do. I looked directly at his countdown, 10 days by then, and instead of simply reading the number, I pushed past it, the way you press your thumb into a bruise just to learn how deep it goes. The room went white at the edges. For less than a second I saw something that wasn't Julian at all, a fluorescent hallway I didn't recognize, a door with a number on it, gone before I could read it, and then my nose was bleeding onto the pillowcase and Julian was still asleep beside me, and I understood that whatever this new part of the power was, it came with a price. I had just paid a small installment on something much larger. I want you to understand that I didn't go looking for the rest of it on purpose. I was scared of what I'd already seen, and I still didn't have a name for it. But fear, it turns out, doesn't stay quiet once it's been fed a first taste of the truth. 7 days before the gala, I finally asked him outright. Not about the countdown, because I could never explain the countdown to anyone. About the apartment. About Camille. About the entire future he seemed to be building without me anywhere inside it. I asked him gently, sitting across from him at the kitchen island, one hand resting on my belly like it might steady my voice. Julian set down his fork very precisely, the way he did everything precisely, and looked directly at me for the first time in what felt like weeks. "I needed an heir my father would accept without a scandal attached to the name," he said. "You were the cleanest option in front of me." That was never meant to be romantic. Then softer, almost gentle, which was somehow worse. "You'll understand everything after the baby's here. Try not to work yourself up before then. It isn't good for you, not for the baby, for you." Like I was livestock he needed kept calm until delivery. Something cracked open in my chest, and without any plan at all, I reached across the table and grabbed his wrist and pushed hard, desperate, the way you claw at a locked door, straight into whatever was sitting behind that countdown. This time the flash didn't fade after a second, it held. A woman in blue scrubs. A consent form on a clipboard, a date I recognized instantly because it was tattooed into my memory as the worst week of the 2 years we'd spent trying. And a name written in blue ink at the top of a lab intake form, a name I already knew, a name that made the fluorescent hallway from 12 nights earlier finally, horribly make sense. Gabriel Reyes. I don't remember standing up. I remember the floor tilting sideways, Julian's voice going very far away and very loud at the same time, and then nothing at all, until I woke up in a hospital bed with a blood pressure cuff biting into my arm and a nurse telling Julian, gently, that stress like this in the 3rd trimester could be dangerous for both of us. Julian held my hand for the nurse's benefit and told the doctor, quietly, that I'd been having some episodes lately. Seeing things, saying things that don't really track. I watched the doctor's face change. I watched a small note get added to my chart. And I understood in one cold drop of realization that Julian hadn't only been planning to leave, he had been building, patiently for weeks, a story in nothing I said afterward could ever be trusted by anyone in that room. They kept me overnight for observation. Julian left after an hour, called away by the office, which I no longer knew how to believe, might have meant Camille, might have meant lawyers, might have meant nothing at all. I couldn't trust my own reading of him anymore, and that frightened me more than any number on the monitor beside my bed. I lay there in the dark with the IV taped to the back of my hand, and cried the kind of crying that doesn't make any noise, that just leaks sideways into the pillow. Because for the first time since I was 7 years old, I wondered if my mother had been wrong about me. Maybe I wasn't gifted at all. Maybe I was exactly what Julian was telling the doctors I was. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I pressed them flat against my stomach and felt one small, definite kick answer back, and I whispered out loud to no one, "I'm not crazy. I'm not crazy." I needed my mother so badly in that moment that my chest physically ached with the shape of her absence, 17 years gone and still the only person who would have believed me without needing a single piece of proof first. Gabriel came at 11 p.m. that night, well past visiting hours, because one of the nurses owed him a favor from a shipping yard injury he'd once quietly paid the medical bill for without telling anyone. He stood in the doorway a long moment before he came all the way in, and I watched his face while I asked him one question as calmly as I could manage with an IV taped into the back of my hand. "Did you ever donate anything at a fertility clinic, years ago, for Julian?" I watched the color leave his face before he said a single word, and that was answer enough. He sat down slowly in the chair beside my bed, and when he finally spoke, his voice had none of its usual ease left in it. 3 years ago. He told me his numbers were low, that it was just for backup, in case they ever needed it, and that it would stay in a bank under his name, never mine. I never asked whose body it might end up in. I didn't think I had the right to ask that question. He looked at my stomach, then at my face, and something behind his eyes broke open. "Nora, tell me it isn't what I think it is." I didn't scream at him, and I didn't cry again, because I was done being the person in that house who fell apart where anyone could watch. I told him very quietly exactly what I needed, the original consent paperwork, if he still had any copy of it anywhere, the name of the doctor who'd processed it, and his willingness to sit for a paternity test the moment results could be sealed by a lab the Ashcroft family didn't control. Gabriel didn't ask me why. He only said, "Whatever you need," and for the first time since the countdown appeared over Julian's head, I felt something in my chest that wasn't fear. The next 6 days moved fast in the specific, focused way that fear moves once it finally has somewhere useful to go. Gabriel found an old digital copy of the consent form buried in a personal email account from 3 years back, Julian's signature clear at the bottom, clinic letterhead reading Kessler Fertility Partners, and one line that turned my stomach over. "Recipient information redacted per patient request." Julian had asked, specifically, for my name to be kept off any paperwork Gabriel might ever see. I went back through 11 days of dinner table recordings I'd taken without any real plan, and found 9 seconds I'd nearly deleted without listening to twice. Julian, on the phone in the hallway outside the dining room, voice low and flat. "Kessler doesn't say a word about the samples, or the arrangement, or any of it, or I pull the funding for his entire wing. Tell him that's not a negotiation." 9 seconds. It was enough. Dr. Kessler folded the moment Gabriel showed up at his office in person instead of calling ahead. Fear of losing a hospital wing with his name on it apparently ran shallower than fear of losing his medical license, and within 2 days we had a private, independently sealed paternity test scheduled at a lab 3 counties away from anything the Ashcroft name could reach. I didn't need the result to tell me what it would say. I needed it to exist somewhere Julian couldn't make disappear. You have to understand, I wasn't doing any of this for revenge, not really, not at first. I was doing it because a man I had trusted for 3 years had let me believe, appointment after appointment, that my own body was the reason we couldn't have a child, and I needed, more than I needed anything else in the world, to know exactly how much of my life had been a story someone else was writing for me. The Ashcroft Foundation gala happened exactly as scheduled, in a ballroom with 300 guests, a string quartet, and a two-story ice sculpture of the company's shipping crest that I remember only because I stared at it so hard while I waited for my moment that the cold started to hurt behind my eyes. Desmond the small stage at 9 p.m., exactly as planned, and gestured for Julian to join him to formally introduce the next chapter of the Ashcroft legacy. His words, delivered to a room full of shareholders, journalists, and old family friends, my 7 months pregnant body angled carefully beside my husband like a prop that had finally hit its mark. I couldn't see the countdown above Julian's head in that light, but I didn't need to see it to know it had ticked down to 0 sometime in the last hour. I stepped forward before Desmond finished his sentence. I didn't raise my voice. I have thought about that a great deal since, how the entire turn of my life happened at conversational volume, the exact volume Julian always used whenever he told me things that gutted me. I asked Desmond, politely, if I could add something to his introduction, and because 300 people were already watching us, he had no graceful way left to say no. I handed him 3 things: a printed consent form with Julian's own signature and the line recipient information redacted per patient request. A 9-second audio clip, played once at full volume, through a phone held up against a live microphone, Julian's voice filling that entire ballroom with the words "Kessler doesn't say a word about the samples." And a sealed, independently notarized paternity report naming Gabriel Reyes as the biological father of the child I was carrying. The room didn't gasp the way rooms do in movies. It went silent in that specific, airless way a room goes silent when 300 people realize, all at once, that they are watching something they were never supposed to see. Desmond's face did something I had never once seen it do in 3 years. It went completely, helplessly blank. Julian recovered first, the way he always did, reaching for the phone still in my hand with an easy laugh already halfway out of his mouth. She's exhausted and pregnant, and I think we should get her some air before she says something she'll regret in front of your investors. A few people near the front actually nodded along, already reaching for the comfortable version of the story where the pregnant woman was the unstable one. It might have worked too, if the recording hadn't still been hanging in the air behind him, if Kessler's own signature wasn't sitting in Desmond's hands, if paper and audio actually cared how charming you sounded while you denied them. He let me believe, for 2 years, that the problem was me. I said into a microphone that suddenly felt very heavy in my hand, every appointment where a doctor looked at me like I'd failed at the one job I had left to do. Every night he held my hand and told me we'll get through this together. He already knew Desmond. He knew the entire time it was never me. That line landed differently than anything I'd said so far. I watched it land. A woman near the front, someone's wife, pressed a hand flat over own mouth. A man I recognized from the business journal that had run Desmond's Next Generation announcement was already typing something into his phone. Desmond looked down at the consent form in his hands like it had grown heavier in the last 10 seconds, and when he finally looked up at his son, whatever was on his face wasn't anger yet, it was something closer to grief. Camille was gone before security even finished walking Julian off that small stage. I watched her slip out a side door, still holding a full champagne flute, and I never saw her at another Ashcroft event again. The board called an emergency session within the week. A public company doesn't survive a recorded admission of bribery and fertility fraud attached to its own Next Generation announcement, and Desmond, humiliated in front of the exact audience he had spent 30 years cultivating, removed Julian as heir apparent before the board even forced a vote. Dr. Kessler surrendered his medical license 2 months later, rather than fight a state board hearing that was never going to go his way. Julian kept the Ashcroft name and very little else that mattered. Gabriel didn't say anything grand to me that night, and he didn't need to. While the room was still frozen and Desmond was still staring down at the paperwork in his hands, Gabriel simply walked up the 2 shallow stairs of that small stage, settled his jacket around my shoulders because I'd started shaking again, and said only quietly, close to my ear, "Sit down before you fall down. I've got you now." Then he did exactly that, walked me to a chair, knelt down in front of it, and stayed there, in front of every single person who had ever treated him like a mistake that got absorbed instead of a son, until my hands finally shaking on their own. June was born 19 days later. 6 pounds 4 ounces, Gabriel's dark eyebrows, my mother's exact shade of eyes. Desmond Ashcroft cried the first time he held her, quietly, in a hospital room nobody had invited him into, and he came to anyway. Blood is blood, whatever gets redacted along the way on a piece of paper, and June was still his granddaughter no matter how badly her existence had been built on somebody else's lie. He came to see me alone 3 days after that, without Julian, and for the first time in 3 years he didn't call me the Calloway girl. He sat stiffly in a chair clearly not built for a man used to sitting at the head of tables, and asked what I wanted for the company, for the Calloway contracts, for myself. Nobody in that family had ever asked me that question, and then actually waited for a real answer. I told him I wanted the Calloway contracts protected no matter what happened between me and Julian from here on, and that I wanted nothing else from him at all. He looked almost disappointed I hadn't asked for more. Then quietly he gave me the contracts anyway, unconditionally, which was as close to an apology as a man like Desmond Ashcroft was ever going to manage. Gabriel moved into the guest cottage behind the main house 2 weeks after June came home, close enough to hear her cry at 2 in the morning, far enough away to never once make me cornered into anything I wasn't ready for yet. Some nights he still shows up with ginger candy out of pure habit, even though the nausea has been gone for months. Some evenings, if I'm being honest, we just sit on the porch steps doing nothing in particular, June asleep against his chest, and it is the most ordinary hour of my entire day, and I have never once taken an ordinary hour for granted since. I still have that cigar box of paper chain links somewhere in a drawer. I haven't added to it since the night of the gala. I still can't see my own countdown, and for the first time in 21 years I don't need to. I already know exactly how this one ends. Did she go far enough, or was she still too merciful? Comment justice if the ending was perfect. Comment harder if you wanted an even colder revenge. Your comments decide how ruthless the next ending should be. Like and subscribe if you want to be here for the next story.